past as chair of the Pre-K through 16 Council. And
do I hear an adjournment motion?
One of those non-debatable motions.
Right.
What happened to Scott?
I'm admitting him again.
Okay.
Our chair got bumped out of the meeting.
I apologize for that. I think I was the guilty party there. I have served as the kind of chair of the subcommittee. And what I would propose is that it would be appropriate, given the fact that we are being reconstituted as a new group, that we, as our first order of business, elect a chair. And I would be happy to entertain any nominations that anyone would like to make to serve as chair of this group.
I'd be happy to nominate you, Scott.
I second that.
Are there any other nominations, or is anyone interested in serving in this capacity?
Scott, I just want to say that I fully support your nomination as chair. I do not believe, however, so I don't want you to take it personally, that I'm actually a voting member of this subcommittee. The secretary is not listed as a member. I appreciate being listed as a member, but I think my role solely is to let you know whether I support Treasurer Pierce's report and recommendation. If you see it differently, let me know, but I know things have changed up with the law.
Okay, thank you. I think just as an aside, I've asked Tom to take a look at the relationship between the sunset law and the underlying statute that governs the trust fund, because there may be a conflict between those two provisions, specifically with regard to your role. So we have a motion to elect me as the chair. We have a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Hey,
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes have it. Thank you very much. And with that concluded, I believe our next order of business is the report from the treasurer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can everybody hear me online? My name is Eric Henry. I'm the Chief Investment Officer in the Treasurer's Office and with the Vermont Pension Investment Commission as well. With me is Katie Green, Deputy Chief Investment Officer. We're here today to talk about the Higher Education Trust Fund. As you know, the intent of the Higher Education Trust Fund is to provide annual 5% distributions to be split among University of Vermont, Vermont State Colleges, and VSAC, but importantly, without dipping into accumulated contributions. During the fiscal year ending June 30, 2021, the fund generated a 14.9% net return and supports a full 5 distribution of $1,584,953, again, to the UVM, Vermont State Colleges, and VSAC. This payment has been initiated and is in process. An additional 2% may be available to be split among the University of Vermont and the Vermont State Colleges, as long as, number one, it does not dip into accumulated contributions, and number two, confirmation that the University of Vermont and the Vermont State Colleges were successful in raising matching funds on a 2-to-1 basis. Last year, University of Vermont and the Vermont State Colleges did indeed request this 2% distribution and committed to the fundraising of 2-to-1 on a matching basis. We're awaiting confirmation that those funds have been raised. If so, The $618,079 will be split among University of Vermont and the Vermont State Colleges. All of this is laid out in more detail on page 3, and we can walk through it relatively quickly, but I think it kind of provides some color on how the funds flow and what really happens within this fund. You can see the beginning balance at the beginning of fiscal, or the ending balance of the prior fiscal year was $31,954,000 on the top line there. There were contributions due to the fund at the end of that fiscal year of $76,853 that have since come in, leading us to an opening balance for fiscal year 2021 of $32,031,007. After taking into consideration the distribution of 3 payments to, again, the University of Vermont, Vermont State Colleges, and VSAC, as well as payments of $305,433 to each to UVM and Vermont State Colleges during the fiscal year. These payments, by the way, would have been requested in fiscal year 20 and paid out in fiscal year 21 following confirmation that those organizations had been successful in raising matching funds on a 2-to-1 basis. During the fiscal year, you can see we earned $677,416 in interest. Assets in the fund appreciated by $3,866,000. Fees of $3,940 were taken out. And you can see these last 2 items, accrued items that were due the fund at the end of the fiscal year, but would have come in subsequently. Unclaimed property of $128,000 and the accrued estate tax of $3,549,000. It's important to accrue these items so that the principal balance at the end of the year reflects the total funds available to support the distributions. Again, you'll see below that we're tracking the accumulated distributions and comparing that to the net fund balance after projected distributions to make sure that we're not dipping into those accumulated contributions. So for the current fiscal year, we are anticipating or indeed are processing a payment of $1,584,953 to the 3 organizations, VSAC, UVM, and the Vermont State Colleges, and anticipating payment of $618,079 to be split among UVM and the Vermont State Colleges. Again, this was requested last year. We're awaiting confirmation that matching 2-to-1 funds have been raised by those organizations. That brings us down to a projected balance after these distributions or potential distributions to $35,890,000. When you compare that to the accumulated contributions of projected balance after the distribution of $35,890,000, it's greater than the threshold of accumulated contributions of $33 million. Again, supporting both the 5% and the 2% distributions. Happy to take any questions. I know this gets confusing, but essentially there are 3 items in play at this point. Number 1 is the 5% payment of $1,584,953 to VSAC, UVM, and the Vermont State Colleges. That payment has been initiated. Number 2, the payment of $618,079 to be split between UVM and the Vermont State Colleges upon confirmation that the matching funds were raised. And then consideration of a potential 2% payment request for the upcoming fiscal year, which we envision being $633,981, presuming again that that payment can be made without dipping into principal at the time of payment, roughly a year from now, and that the UVM and the Vermont State Colleges have been able to raise matching funds over the upcoming year.
Eric, if I could ask one question just for clarification there, and I think it's noteworthy. The accrued estate tax, the kind of 3.5 million that I see in the report, that is new. Is that new estate tax revenue in excess of the 125% that has now been essentially invested in the account?
I'm not sure I understand. I'm not familiar with the 125% requirement. This is essentially excess accrued state tax that will be coming into the higher ed trust fund. This is checks. I believe it's actually come in since the fiscal year has ended. Regarding the statutory criteria for it, I'm unfamiliar with that.
And one of the reasons that I wanted to point it out is that I think this is the first time since, roughly 2011 that the state budget has been such that there's not been any recapture of or readjustment of the the revenue projections for the estate tax. So this is the first significant contribution that we've seen in quite some time. That's kind of wonderful news. And I think kind of evidence of the success that the legislature and the administration have had managing the budget the past 2 years.
And the fact that we're accruing these this year is a new treatment because the numbers were so significant. We wanted to include them in the distributable balance to make sure we had sufficient dollars there to support the payments.
Thank you. Any questions for Eric on the presentation thus far?
I had a quick question, which was on the confirmation. I'm aware of a letter last year, or it may have been earlier this year, I don't remember, but sort of attesting to the fact that we had raised those funds. When you talk about confirmation, is there actual documentation that you need beyond an attestation in terms of the funds that have been raised by by VSC and UVM?
That certification comes from,
So the treasurer's office receives the certification from the Commissioner of Finance and Management. So they would be better suited to explain that process, but I believe it's just the attestation, but we're not as familiar with it.
but we
Okay.
do the documentation, documented confirmation of that before those payments can be initiated.
Okay, all right.
And Scott,
Yes.
Wendy, we would have that documented in our annual audit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And because of the fact that we receive state funds, we do a monthly report that talks about our financial position, et cetera. So I'm sure that those numbers are included in there. This is something that we do every year. So I think we should be all set.
I was just thinking in terms of the fact that this is the time of year that we usually get final drafts of, the final audits, so, that's like where the rubber hits the road at the end of the year.
That's true.
Any further questions about the pieces that we have discussed up till now? Sophie, would you like us to reach out to the treasurer's office to clarify what the documentation requirements are?
We can probably do that. That's fine. I'm kind of new to all this, so I just wasn't sure I'm aware of one thing we submitted. I wasn't sure if there were other pieces. So yeah, we can follow up and find out. Thanks though, Scott.
Thank you. Any other questions for the team from the treasurer's office on this portion of the report? Now, I believe that one other kind of item of business at this time last year, we also at least provisionally approved the 2% expenditure for next year. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes.
And I believe that would be in order for us to do again as well if the committee so desires. And it appears, based on what has been provided by the treasurer's office, that the health of the trust fund and the returns that we have seen managed would support that, at least from a statutory perspective. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Typically, we've deferred to the VSC and to kind of UVM on this, and I'd be interested, Sophie, or in you or Wendy's thoughts on what we should recommend for next year.
I think given the health of the fund, we would be in favor of recommending taking the distribution next year.
As would we.
Would anyone be interested in putting forward a motion to make that recommendation?
So moved.
Thank you, Brian. Second?
Yep, second. Susan.
Susan,
Thank you, Susan. Any further discussion? If none, all in favor, say aye.
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 I,
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The motion carries. Thank you very much. Maybe one final kind of round of questions I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more of. As those of you on the Treasurer's investment team, are looking to the future, would be interested in anything that you can share with us regarding what performance you are seeing, so far this fiscal year, and whether or not anything in the kind of economic environment is leading you to think differently about the investment strategies.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. So it's relatively early in the fiscal year to look at a month or two's performance and try to extrapolate anything meaningful from that. What we are seeing across essentially every asset class is that valuations are very high relative to their historical trend. To us, that implies lower return expectations going forward. And indeed, we're seeing capital market assumptions from our consultants and investment managers come down. You may have seen that a year ago, we lowered the assumed rate of return on the pension plans from 7.5% to 7% in recognition of those trends. It's difficult. I would say the flip side of that is that it's very difficult for us to make any kind of accurate forecast of returns. So while when we look at current valuations of equities, they're very high relative to history. When we look at valuations of bonds, they're very high based on the fact that interest rates are so low. Real estate values, especially residential, are very high relative to their long-term trends. Again, we believe these indicate lower expected returns going forward. We obviously won't know the outcome of that until we fast forward into the future and look back to see what actually happened. But based on what we know, we would expect to see returns being somewhat muted in the future.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, this is not a question, but if I may, Chair, the statute does require this council, which they've just done, to authorize the treasurer to make the additional distribution up to 2%. And it requires the Secretary of Administration, to authorize it as well. So in my role as secretary, I would put on the record that we certainly agree with the decision of the council to authorize the 2% distribution. And if the treasurer's office needs anything in writing in that regard, they should just let me or Melissa know, and we'll get you what you need.
Thank you very much, Secretary Young. If there are no further questions for the kind of treasurer's team, kind of Eric and Katie, thank you for a wonderful report. It's obviously very encouraging to see the positive returns we received this year, and the fact that for the last 2 years we've been able to authorize the 2% distribution to support the endowment building efforts of the VSC and UVM, as well as provide increased support for need-based financial aid. So thank you for the work that you've done. Thank you for the fine report that you all have done and for making that available to us. Is there any other business that any member of the committee would like to bring before the group? If none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I think it's been moved and seconded. So all in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Abstention?